Thank you to the organisers and to Tate for the opportunity to present at this fantastic conference. I'm going to present an overview of Derry Camerawork, which was a community photography project that ran in my hometown of Derry during the last decade of the Troubles. What I'll do is I'll focus on particular themes that emerge from the archive, and I'll present their historical context. The title slide here actually features stills from the film Picturing Derry with members of Derry Camerawork. Produced in 1985, Picturing Derry comprises interviews with amateur and professional photographers, and Tricia Siff, who founded Derry Camerawork, is pictured on the right here, interviewing a local amateur photographer, Eileen Robson. Tricia Siff begins her contribution to Picturing Derry by reflecting on how most people's view of the city is formed by images from the press. Images perhaps like this, of how police brutality erupted at a civil rights march in October 1968 in Derry, a moment which signalled the birth of the Troubles to the international press. Or images like this, and this is Clive Limpkin, and this is images of rioting from the Battle of the Bogside in 1969. And his book was published in 1972, and 1972 was also the year of Bloody Sunday. And these shocking images depict the aftermath of what happened when British soldiers shot dead 13 unarmed civilians at a civil rights march. Siff would later create an exhibition called Hidden Truths, including these images from Bloody Sunday. Tricia Siff was a photographer, curator, and filmmaker from Leeds in England who studied art at Goldsmiths College. She worked with community arts and photography groups such as Camerawork in London, which has already been mentioned by Joy and Charlene. In 1979, a special issue of Camerawork was published reporting on Northern Ireland. Siff was also involved with a socialist feminist group that supported political prisoners in Northern Ireland, and she was an editor of the book Women in Collective Action, shown here. And Women in Collective Action included a chapter by the Derry Relative Action Committee, and they'd been set up in 1976 when special category status was removed from political prisoners in Northern Ireland. In the book Still War, Siff says that her commitment to going to Northern Ireland had been fueled by the hunger strike of 1981, when 10 men died in the struggle to be recognised as political prisoners. We'd seen pictures of rioting and of working class communities who'd been battling injustice, she said. We heard the media's versions, but rarely those of the people involved. I was invited to go myself, not to create yet another version, but to share my photographic skills with a group of young people who decided they wanted to make their own photographs to document their own reality. I planned on a year, I stayed 4. Derry is the second city of Northern Ireland, and it's located in the northwest on the border with the Irish Republic. While the city's Catholic or nationalist community call the city Derry, the Protestant or Unionist community often refer to it as Londonderry, which is how it's described on the map here. Derry's geographical location on the border with the Irish Republic and the segregation of its population has featured prominently in the work of local artist Willie Doherty. In the 1960s, Derry encompassed a 2/3 majority Catholic population, yet few nationalist representatives were elected due to the gerrymandering of electoral boundaries constructed to secure a unionist majority. Moreover, universal suffrage did not apply in local government elections in Northern Ireland. So while business owners had multiple votes, some tenants had none. Catholics were further discriminated against in employment, education, and housing. And these were all major factors in the civil rights movement that began in the late 1960s, a movement that was directly inspired by the civil rights movement in the United States. Siff lived in the Bogside of Derry, an area that had become known as Free Derry. And this is the Free Derry Wall, as pictured by Derry Camerawork, and this wall still stands. It was originally the gable wall of a house, and now it's part of the heritage tour. The wall signalled entry to a part of the city that had once been a no-go area for British state forces, and it was there that Derry Camerawork began, in the same nationalist housing estate of the Battle of the Bogside in 1969 and the traumatic murders of Bloody Sunday in 1972. In Still War, SIF includes this image by the British photographer Mike Abrahams, and says that she also experienced at first hand the reality of living under occupation, subject to dawn raids, when her home was taken apart and searched by the British Army. This is a photograph taken by Sif herself of the rubble of the demolished Rossville Flats, where she had once lived, also located in the Bogside. The mural pictured in the background on the left was painted by one of the founding members of Camerawork. And this Irish language mural translates as "I am Ireland." In picturing Derry, another founding member of Camerawork suggests that young people use mural painting to demonstrate their culture and their language. Photography then became another way for them to explore and express their cultural identity. Camerawork Derry was similar to its counterpart in London. It provided training in photographic skills and access to darkroom facilities. Part funded by the Gulbenkian Foundation, it began in 1982, the year after the 1981 hunger strikes, and it ran for 10 years. The majority of its members were young, working-class women who came from Catholic housing estates most affected by the Troubles. But the collective also included members from nearby Protestant estates. They shared a common dissatisfaction with the stereotypical depictions of their city published in the mainstream British press. The young people who SIF came to work with were also concerned with how the media seemed intent on demonising them. Derry Camerawork produced images of young people that would counter the predominant representation of them as rioters, and I'm showing some screenshots from Picturing Derry of early Derry Camerawork exhibition material here. And one of their first exhibitions, Cat on the Brew, focused on the impact of unemployment on the lives of individuals. Many Camerawork members were also unemployed, and they received support through the Action for Community Employment scheme. Cat on the Brew, which was shown at the Orchard Gallery in Derry in 1983, aimed to present a more accurate and less sensational image of young people who were unemployed. Presented on laminated sheets, the exhibition was designed for travelling, and it was shown in venues including the Cockpit Gallery here in London. Derry Camerawork members also travelled to England to discuss their work with students at Farnham, but it was in their meeting with the black community in Tottenham that they encountered shared experiences of unemployment and police harassment. Camerawork reveals the everyday reality of working-class life in the 1980s. Derry, like many cities in the north of England, was undergoing economic recession. Cities that had previously had thriving manufacturing industries were rapidly declining under a Thatcher government. Trade unions and employment rights were also under attack. And Camerawork documented trade union marches and people actively engaged in campaigns for better employment conditions and for the right to work. Derry had particularly high male unemployment, and Camerawork photographed young people signing on the dole. Many of the jobs that were available were low-skilled jobs for women in local shirt factories, and Camerawork also recorded the working lives of women in these factories. Women feature prominently in Derry Camerawork. The archive depicts the everyday struggle of women in a working-class community. This photograph was taken by Derry Camerawork member Geraldine Norby, and it was published in the book Women in Focus, which examines the problematic position of women in Ireland. The archive contains many images of older women in particular, and some of these are uncatalogued, like these ones. and this is women in a local pub. Camerawork also documented women's activism, including national campaigns for liberty and protests concerning international issues such as nuclear disarmament. These photographs are from a May Day rally in 1983, and they include local politicians Martin McGuinness, now Deputy First Minister, and Eamon McCann. And here are two local women who are watching the rally, and they happen to be from Republican families, a fact which is highlighted by the badge of the woman on the right. The archive reveals a transition in the role of women in nationalist activism. So we can see them as observers, but also as participants. And the archive also reveals images of women serving key roles in paramilitary parades. This one's in Belfast, this one's in Derry. Women were at the forefront of the hardship endured by working class communities during the Troubles. Some were thrust into confrontation with state forces. When their partners or children were interned without trial. It was a struggle to bring children up in an environment of harassment from state forces, and where paramilitaries demonstrated a show of strength. Some would go on to lose their children in the conflict. And this is a photograph of a hunger strike commemoration rally, and it includes family members of Patsy O'Hara, who was one of the 10 men who died on a hunger strike. In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday and the hunger strikes, women had gained greater recognition in their community. Mary Nellis became involved in tenants' associations and was the mother of 2 sons in prison. She was a founding member of the Derry Relatives Action Committee that I mentioned earlier, who campaigned against the ending of political status for prisoners. So she's pictured here writing signs for a protest march, and the protest march is actually this one, and it was a protest against police violence against women. And she's also pictured here in the Women in Focus book, which I mentioned earlier, which is also taken by Derry Camerawork. Nels would later become a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. An article on her in Spare Rib included a photograph of her addressing a rally during the blanket protests in 1978, when prisoners refused to wear a prison uniform as part of their demands for recognition of their political status. Nellis saw her struggle as not only with the visible presence of British occupation, but also with the invisible oppression of women by men and by the Catholic Church. Women had historically been sidelined in Irish politics, as Alva's paper highlighted, despite some notable exceptions, such as Bernadette Devlin, and this is Devlin pictured on the cover of Spare Rib in 1981. There are significant tensions in Ireland between feminism and nationalism. Nell McCafferty, the Derry-born journalist, saw nationalism as a feminist issue. She called on the women's movement to support female prisoners in Armagh jail in her article, "It is my belief that Armagh is a feminist issue." Armagh was the women's prison in Northern Ireland, and it's seen in the background of this photograph showing supporters waving at the women prisoners inside. Large crowds gathered to show their support for the women prisoners, who had also fought against the ending of political status through actions including hunger strike. One of their most sustained actions was the No Wash protest. Tricia Siff has said that my real introduction to Irish politics was through the support of the women on the No Wash protest in Armagh, and my very first trip to the north was on International Women's Day. The Camerawork archive also includes images of groups of women from England who travelled to Northern Ireland to show their support. And the photographs show the solidarity that existed between women's groups and prison campaign groups across the UK. They were united in protesting against the mistreatment of prisoners, including the use of strip searching. On International Women's Day, we see some supporters carrying placards with the names of women prisoners. Camerawork also documented local activism, as in this image of a woman and her children protesting outside the housing executive or council offices in Derry. The Catholic community in Derry had endured historic discrimination in the allocation of housing. And this was a situation that was linked to an electoral system that operated according to house occupancy. Derry Camerawork worked with the residents of the Rossville flats, documenting the damp conditions of their homes and supporting their campaign for better housing. And members of Derry Camerawork are included in this photograph of a tenants' protest outside the council office in Derry. Derry Camerawork worked with tenants' groups and community resource centres, and they ran workshops that were particularly aimed at women and young people, enabling them to represent themselves in distinction to how their city was portrayed by visiting journalists. Derry Camerawork comprises the output of a community whose lived experience of the Troubles far outweighs the transitory encounter of visiting photojournalists. Moreover, these images contrast sharply with media attempts to affirm social order. The British government's account of the conflict in Northern Ireland as not only a military war, but a propaganda war, is particularly pertinent to Derry. The then Prime Minister Edward Heath's assertion was made in 1972 in a meeting with Lord Widgery, who later conducted the first inquiry into Bloody Sunday. The Troubles entailed not only a war of words, but a war of images. Photographic and filmic representations were particularly important and subject to censorship. And British media censorship became most evident during the broadcasting ban that began in 1988. Media coverage of Northern Ireland often demonstrated a consensus that denied the history of colonialism and oppression and laid the blame for the Troubles with the nationalist community. Actions of terrorism by state forces and their collusion with loyalist paramilitaries were also overlooked. Derry Camerawork came of age during the Troubles and they experienced the trauma directly. They captured images of confrontation with the British Army and the REC, a Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force. Republican funerals were particularly fraught and heavily policed. And this is an image of police charging with batons. And this photograph shows the police firing plastic bullets at mourners. And this image was later used in a Bloody Sunday commemoration poster. The Camerawork also documented the victims of plastic bullets. As Ariella Zuli contends in her civil contract of photography, photographs enable injured parties to present their grievances in person or through others. Photographs like these were rarely seen in the press. Camerawork depicted the reality of life during the Troubles, not just moments of confrontation, but scenes of everyday life, such as children at play, people at work, or enjoying life. Moments that the press seemed uninterested in or incapable of capturing. I had always been very conscious of how photographers tended to come to Ireland to photograph moments of heightened trouble, such as the Battle of the Bogside, says Sif. They're not there every day. They don't photograph humour. They don't photograph everyday life. Camerawork, in contrast, demonstrate wit and also acute observation skills, as in this decisive moment of an armoured REC vehicle beneath a billboard proclaiming, "Normally, this space would be trying to tell you what to think." The juxtaposition of a Saracen with a banner promoting independence is further highlighted by the photograph of the independent newspaper underneath and the slogan asking, "It is, are you?" We find humour too in photographs of protests against the British Army's use of surveillance towers. In Photography Politics 1, published in 1979 by Photography Workshop, Sif reflected on working with the community arts group for Southwark. Critical of the role of the visiting documentary photographer, Sif writes that she felt personally alienated by that practice. The people are pictured and revealed. They remain passive to the camera. In contrast, Sif worked collectively with the community representing itself. Derry Camerawork embodied a community's opposition to being portrayed as passive subjects, objectified by a media that towed the British Conservative Party's agenda. The work resonates with Azuli's claim that, quote, photography is one of the distinctive practices in which individuals can establish a distance between themselves and power in order to observe its actions and to do so not as its subjects. A community that was forever surveyed by armed forces on the ground, in the air, and from observation towers, were able to challenge that surveillance. In Derry, Camerawork informed, empowered, and liberated its members. Collectively, they embraced freedom of speech and freedom of expression. A community whose democratic representation was often denied became citizens of photography. Thank you.